The day my neighbor told me that 4 feet of my property wasn't a big deal was the same day I decided this was either going to end with an apology or a very expensive lesson. At the time, I didn't know which one it would be. What I did know was that every time I backed my truck out of the driveway, I could feel my blood pressure rising. Now, before I get into all that, let me give you a little context. I live in a small town outside of Asheville, North Carolina, in a neighborhood called Maple Hollow. It's the kind of place where people still wave at each other from their front porches and where local gossip travels faster than the internet. I've lived there for almost 11 years. Not because it's fancy, not because the houses are huge. Honestly, most of them aren't. I stayed because it was quiet, predictable, the kind of place where you could leave for vacation and trust your neighbors to keep an eye on things. My house sat on a corner lot, and one of the reasons I bought it was the driveway. It ran alongside the house and stretched all the way back to a detached workshop that I converted into a garage years ago. Nothing glamorous, just enough room for my truck, some woodworking tools, and a collection of fishing gear I kept promising myself I'd use more often. The previous owner next door was a retired firefighter named Frank Mercer. Frank was one of those guys everybody liked. Always had a joke ready. Always had cold beer in the garage. We got along great. One summer evening years ago, we were sitting in lawn chairs watching a thunderstorm roll through when he pointed at the strip of gravel between our properties and laughed. That driveway of yours is basically your kingdom. I remember laughing and raising my beer. Damn, right it is. It became a running joke between us. Maybe that's why what happened later bothered me so much. Because that line had always been respected. Until it wasn't. Everything started changing the spring Frank sold his house. A young family moved in. Not young. Probably late 30s. The husband was named Ryan Caldwell. His wife was Melissa. They had 2 kids, a golden retriever, and enough energy to renovate an entire neighborhood if somebody gave them permission. At first, I actually liked them. Ryan was friendly, charismatic, the kind of guy who could make you feel like an old friend 5 minutes after meeting you. The first day they moved in, he walked over while I was mowing the lawn and introduced himself. "We've got big plans for this place," he said with a grin. I remember nodding. Most people say something like that when they move in. Didn't seem unusual, but about 3 weeks later, construction trucks started showing up. Then lumber, then concrete, then contractors. Every morning, there seemed to be more people walking around his property, carrying clipboards and measuring things. One afternoon, I wandered over and asked what was going on. Ryan looked excited. "We're adding a second garage." "Nice," I said. "Workshop too. Maybe eventually." He pointed toward the side yard. "We want enough space for everything." I glanced over to where he was pointing. Something immediately fell off. I couldn't explain it. The location just looked close. Really close. But I brushed it off. I figured professionals had handled the plans. People don't accidentally build garages on someone else's property. At least that's what I thought. A week later, I was backing my truck out for work. Same routine I'd done hundreds of times. Coffee in one hand. Radio on low. Half asleep. Then I slammed on the brakes. Hard. My driver's side mirror had missed one of their new support beams by maybe an inch. Maybe less. I sat there for a second, staring through the windshield. Heart pounding, trying to understand what had just happened. Then I got out, walked toward the edge of the driveway, and looked up. That's when I saw it. Not just the support beam, not just the framing, the entire roof line. The overhang wasn't near my driveway. It wasn't close to my driveway. It was hanging over my driveway. A lot. I took several steps backward and stared. The shadow from the structure stretched directly across my gravel. And for the first time, a thought entered my mind that I couldn't shake. There is absolutely no way they don't know this. A few minutes later, I spotted Ryan talking with one of the contractors. "You walked over." Kept my voice calm. Kept my expression neutral. At least I tried to. "Hey," I said. He smiled. "What's up?" I pointed toward the structure. "That garage looks like it's coming over my property." The contractor suddenly became very interested in his clipboard. Ryan glanced at the building, then back at me, and laughed. Not a nervous laugh. Not a confused laugh. The kind of laugh people give when they think you're making a mountain out of a molehill. "No, we're fine." "Are you sure?" The builder measured everything. I stared at him. "Did you get a survey done?" He shrugged. "That's what we paid them for." Then he took a sip of his coffee and casually added the sentence that would eventually cost him tens of thousands of dollars. I mean, it's only a few feet. And right there, standing under the shadow of a garage that didn't belong on my land, I realized something. This wasn't going to be a misunderstanding. This was going to be a fight. And the next phone call I made would change everything. The next morning, before I even poured my first cup of coffee, I called a surveyor. I wasn't looking for a fight. Honestly, part of me hoped I was wrong. Because if I was wrong, great. I'd apologize, maybe look like an idiot for a day, and life would move on. But if I was right, well, then somebody had built a garage on land they didn't own. 3 days later, a surveyor named Hank Delaney pulled in my driveway in an old white pickup that looked older than both of us combined. Hank had the kind of face that looked permanently unimpressed, like he'd spent 30 years settling arguments between stubborn people and wasn't surprised by much anymore. He climbed out, looked at the garage, looked at me, and said, "Let me guess. Neighbor issue." I laughed. "That obvious?" He nodded. "The second most common reason people call me." "What's the first?" "Divorce." That told me everything I needed to know. For the next hour, he worked methodically around both properties, checking old markers, comparing county records, taking measurements, making notes. The whole process looked incredibly boring from the outside. But every few minutes I'd catch him glancing toward Ryan's new garage. And every time he did, something in my stomach tightened. Finally, he stopped near the edge of my driveway, reached into the bed of his truck, pulled out a bright red survey stake, then drove it into the ground with 3 hard swings of a hammer. Thunk, thunk, thunk. The sound echoed across the neighborhood. "I åkte over." "What are we looking at?" Hank motioned for me to follow him. We moved from marker to marker until we reached the garage. Then he stopped, pointed, and said the words I'd been expecting and dreading at the same time. "That's not close." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He looked at me. "I mean, it's not close to the property line." Then he pointed again. "It's over it." I felt my chest tighten. "How far?" "Just over 4 feet." I stared at the structure. 4 feet. Not inches. Not a measurement somebody could accidentally miss. 4 feet. Then Hank pointed toward the roof. "The overhang extends farther than that." I slowly rubbed the back of my neck. "So I'm not imagining this." "Nope." "Any gray area?" He shook his head. "None." There it was. Clear. Simple. Undeniable. By the time Hank left, I had a complete report, photographs, measurements, diagrams, and enough documentation to make the situation very difficult for anyone to argue with. That evening I printed everything. Every page. Every image, every measurement. Then I slid it all into a large envelope. The next morning, I walked across the lawn and dropped it into Ryan's mailbox. No note, no threats, no drama, just facts. Then I waited. 1 day passed. Nothing. 2 days. Nothing. 3 days. Still nothing. And that's when I realized something important. Silence is a response. Sometimes it's the loudest response there is. So I walked over and knocked on his door. Ryan opened it after a long delay. Gone was the friendly smile I'd met months earlier. Now he looked annoyed, like I was interrupting something more important. I held up another copy of the survey. "You get these?" He barely glanced at the paperwork. "Yeah." And he sighed. Actually sighed, like I was being unreasonable. "Look, man, tearing down part of that garage isn't happening." I stared at him. "It's on my property. It cost a fortune." I waited. He crossed his arms. Then came the sentence. Again, that same sentence. "It's only a few feet." I don't know why that bothered me more than the garage itself. Maybe because it revealed exactly how he saw the situation. Not as right or wrong. Not as property ownership. Not as respect. Just inconvenience. His inconvenience mattered. Mine didn't. I pointed toward my driveway. "My truck barely clears now. You'll figure out." I remember looking at him and realizing something. He genuinely believed this would eventually become my problem. That if he ignored it long enough, I'd adapt. Accept it. Move on. I nodded once. Okay. That was it. No jilling. No threats. Just okay. Then I turned around and left. Now here's where most people expect me to say I called a lawyer. I didn't. I thought about it. A lot. But lawsuits move slower than molasses in January. Months. Years. Endless hearings. Paperwork. Legal fees. Meanwhile, I'd still have to stare at that garage every single day. So instead, I started researching. Property records, county regulations, access rights, building codes, easements, everything I could find, night after night. hours at a time. The deeper I dug, the more one fact became crystal clear. My driveway belonged entirely to me. Not shared, not partially shared, not subject to some weird access agreement. Mine, 100%. And once I understood that, an idea started forming. At first it was just a thought, a tiny little thought, the kind that sneaks into your head and refuses to leave. I was sitting in my garage one evening, sanding a piece of oak when I looked toward the driveway entrance. Then I looked toward Ryan's garage, then back toward the entrance, and suddenly the entire picture clicked into place. I actually laughed out loud, not because it was mean, not because it was revenge, because it was perfectly legal. The next morning, I called a metal fabrication company about 20 minutes away. A guy named Eddie answered. I explained what I needed. 2 steel posts, 1 heavy crossbar, permanent installation. Simple, functional, nothing decorative. There was a brief pause. Then he asked the question, how much clearance do you want? I looked out the window, toward Ryan's garage, toward the section hanging over my property, and toward the turning angle every vehicle needed to make. Then I gave him a number. 7 feet. Silence. I could almost hear him picturing it. Finally, he said, yeah, we can do that. We scheduled the installation for the following week. And for the first time since this whole mess started, I slept like a baby because Ryan thought the problem was a survey report. He thought the problem was paperwork. What he didn't realize was that the real problem was about to arrive in a work truck carrying several 100 pounds of steel. And when that steel went up, the entire balance of power between us was about to change. The installation crew showed up on a Thursday morning just after 8. I was already outside with a cup of coffee when their truck rolled into the driveway. 3 guys climbed out. No drama, no urgency, just another job on their schedule. But for me, it felt like the beginning of the final act. They unloaded the steel posts first. Heavy black powder-coated steel, solid enough to survive a hurricane. Then came a crossbar. Long, simple. Immistakabli permanent. The crew started marking locations near the entrance of my driveway while I stood off to the side watching. About 15 minutes later, I heard a front door slam. I didn't even have to look. I already knew who it was. Ryan was walking toward us. Fast. His wife Melissa followed several steps behind. Both of them looked confused. Ryan pointed at the workers. What are they doing? I took another sip of coffee. Installing a clearance bar. A what? A vehicle height restriction. He frowned. Why would you do that? I shrugged. To protect access to my garage. The crew continued working. Digging holes. Setting posts. Mixing concrete. Nobody paid attention to Ryan, which somehow seemed to irritate him even more. What does that even mean? I looked directly at him. It means it's my driveway. There was a pause. Then he looked up as the workers lifted the crossbar into position. And right then I watched the realization hit him. It wasn't immediate. It happened in stages. First confusion, then calculation, then panic. His eyes moved from the steel bar to my driveway, to his garage, then back to the steel bar again. How high is that? 7 feet. The color seemed to drain from his face. 7 feet. That's right. He stared for another few seconds, doing the math. The same math I had already done. The only practical approach to his garage required vehicles to swing partially across the entrance of my driveway. That extra space was what made the turn easy. Without it, everything became tight, awkward, risky, especially for larger vehicles. Ryan turned back toward me. You can't do this. I tilted my head. Why not? Because you're blocking access to our garage. I let the silence hang there for a moment. Then I said something that made Melissa visibly wince. Interesting. What does that mean? It means you're upset because something on my property is making your garage harder to use. His jaw tightened instantly. For a second, I thought he might explode. Instead, he just stared at me. Because there wasn't much he could say. Everything I was doing was legal. Everything he had done wasn't. The workers finished about 20 minutes later. They tightened the last bolts, packed up their equipment, then drove away, leaving the black steel crossbar standing there like a permanent reminder that property lines aren't suggestions. The next morning, I got my first show. Ryan backed his pickup truck down the alley behind the houses. Slowly, carefully, trying to line himself up with the garage. I happened to be watering flowers near the porch. Completely by coincidence, of course. He attempted the turn once. Stopped. Backed up. Tried again. Stopped. backed up again. After 5 minutes, he parked on the street and walked away. I won't lie. I enjoyed that more than I probably should have. Over the following days, things got worse. A delivery driver arrived with building supplies. One look at the approach angle, and he gave up. A landscaping trailer couldn't make the turn. A contractor's van couldn't make the turn. Every vehicle larger than a sedan suddenly had problems. The garage still existed, technically, but functionally, it was becoming an expensive storage shed. And every day that passed seemed to make Ryan a little quieter, a little less confident, a little more aware of the situation he'd created. 2 weeks later, there was a knock on my door. I opened it. Ryan stood there alone. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he sighed, not the irritated sigh he'd given me before, a tired one, the kind people make when reality finally wins. Can we talk? I stepped outside. Sure. He glanced toward the driveway, toward the steel bar, then toward his garage. This isn't working. I nodded. I noticed. A faint smile appeared on his face despite himself, probably because he knew he deserved that one. For several seconds, he stared at the ground. Then finally he said it. The survey was right. I waited. We should have handled this differently. Another pause. Then came the question I had been waiting weeks to hear. What would it take to fix it? Now what can we do? Not meet me halfway. Not let's compromise. What would it take? I already knew my answer. I'd known it since the day Hank drove those red stakes into the ground. You moved the garage. His eyes closed briefly, like a man hearing the exact number he didn't want to hear. Completely? Completely. No verang. No verang. No part crossing the line. Not 1 inch. He looked toward the steel bar again, then back at me. And if I do that, I remove the bar. Simple. Clean. Fair. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. Then finally he nodded. Slowly. Reluctantly. But honestly. Okay. The actual reconstruction took nearly a month. Contractors returned. Sections came down. Framing was rebuilt. Roof lines were adjusted. Money disappeared. Lots of money. The entire neighborhood watched. And the funny thing was that nobody seemed surprised, because by then everyone knew exactly what had happened. Eventually the work was finished. A final inspection confirmed the structure sat entirely on Ryan's property, exactly where it should have been from the beginning. A few days later, I called the metal crew back. They unbolted the crossbar, loaded it onto a truck, and drove away. Just like that, the driveway was open again. No celebration, no speeches, no dramatic victory lap. Just space, the way it had always been supposed to be. These days, Ryan and I aren't friends. Probably never will be. But we're civil. We wave. We nod. We keep things simple. And honestly, that's enough. Because the older I get, the more I realize most neighbor disputes aren't really about land. They're about respect. The land is just where the argument happens. The real fight is whether people believe your boundaries matter. Maybe some viewers will think I went too far. Maybe others think I should have sued immediately. Maybe some think Ryan deserved exactly what happened. I don't know. What I do know is this. If I had accepted those 4 feet, what would have come next? Another 4? A fence? A shed? At what point does a small violation stop being small? That's a question I want to leave with you. So tell me down in the comments. If your neighbor built part of a garage on your property and refused to fix it, what would you have done? Would you have gone straight to court? Would you have tried to negotiate longer? Or would you have found your own way to make the lesson impossible to ignore? And while you're down there, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who's ever dealt with a difficult neighbor. Because trust me, not every property dispute ends this peacefully.